Hello everyone. Welcome to this tutorial on linear workflow using Maya 2012 and Vray 2.0. Um, I'll be doing this one on again linear workflow, but using Maya and Vray this time. Um, so let's get started on this. I'm gonna try and make this as easy to understand as possible without too many technical details, and I'll point you in a few directions where you can go and look up some stuff on your own, and you'll be able to understand uh, some of the things that I'll be talking about in this tutorial here. So to start with, let's go and have a look at the settings that I use for V-Ray, the universal settings, or you can also call them as Needlehole settings, which are very popular, which you can actually find on the V-Ray for Maya, uh, the documentation for V-Ray for Maya. And if you look up under V-Ray for Maya on Spot 3D and look for the tutorial section, you have a link here called universal V-Ray settings. And if I want to go and download those, there's actually a PDF file from Robert Needlehole. You will find some settings here that you can use to get nice images out of V-Ray. Like I said, I'm not gonna go too deep into this because you can actually go and read through this document and find all of the information. I'm sure you have your own settings for V-Ray. If you have been using V-Ray, you will have your own settings, and of course they change from project to project, and but these settings are pretty good as a starting point when you're trying to set up your scene and working along. I'll walk you through some of these settings before we go and set everything up. But if you're looking for a proper linear workflow, this is a nice starting point. I'll show you some of the things that are not right with it, and I'll show you how to fix those in a moment. So to start with, what the Needlehole settings do is they bring down all of the settings to practically a single uh, parameter here in the V-Ray, that is has to do with the anti-aliasing, the image sampling. So looking at this, as you can see, I'm using the adaptive the DMC sampler. uh, Instead of going and tweaking all the other settings, like here in the settings, the DMC sampler, uh, you can pretty much go and deal with all of that using just the image sampler here, that you have here, using this threshold value. So uh, this is basically to take care of all the anti-aliasing as well as all of the noise. As you can see here, I've got some noise because my threshold is kind of on the default side. So if I were to go and if I were to lower this 0 point, let's say 0.005, I'm gonna have lesser noise here. So basically that's going to take care of the noise as well as all of the anti-aliasing, by just coming here and using the DMC sampler and setting up the samples to sample 50 or 30 for the max subdivs, and 1 for the minimum subdivisions. I can take care of those things. Like I said, I'm not going to go too deep into explaining each and every parameter here. You can always go look it up in the documentation and see what that does. One thing I can recommend is to take this adaptive amount, and instead of using any adaptive amount, you can always leave it off to 1 and let the DMC sampler take care of all of the noise here. That can also be done. I like to just leave that off to the 0.08. the default setting there. The other things pertaining to linear workflow, so let's go tab wise here again. Under Vray Commons, I like setting up a file name as well as the format that I'll be rendering in, and again I'm using a EXR multi-channel format here. Other things that I also like to set up, as you can see, I'm rendering at a smaller image size here, and what I like also doing is to use the Vray frame buffer. Always use the Vray frame buffer if you want to see what's happening in the render. If you're trying to follow the linear workflow that I'm setting up here, use the Vray frame buffer. And if you wanted to view your images using the Maya's frame buffer, you would want to convert those as well to the sRGB here by checking that. So you will also see that in the linear, in the sRGB with the sRGB curve applied to it. And you can see that here in the frame buffer that I have checked the sRGB to display it properly on my monitor here, or else this is how the image looks when I am following the linear workflow. So I can turn that on and see how that actually looks like with the curve applied to it with a gamma of 2.2. So I can check that on the frame buffer. A couple of things to keep in mind when following the linear workflow. This is where you set it up under Vray under color mapping. So if I go under color mapping, you can see that I'm using linear multiply, and let me just look this up. Okay, so under color mapping you have the type set to linear, so this is what you would want to use, and set the gamma of 2.2. This would be set to 1, so I'm gonna apply a gamma of 2.2, and also check affect background as well as don't affect colors adaptation only. So what that's going to do is it's going to apply a gamma of 2.2 when you're rendering your images, but it's not going to bake that into your image, so you would want to check that. Now the thing that I found that was wrong, that I thought that was wrong with the linear workflow in the Needlehole settings in the document was to use the linear workflow here, checking this linear workflow here. Now what this is going to do is, if you remember in the mental ray part that we did, the mental ray video that we did, we were applying a gamma of 0.45 4 on the images, excuse me. So the linear workflow, checking the linear workflow here is going to be doing the same thing. Instead of going and adding those gamma nodes into our textures, we could deal with that right here by just checking this too good to be true. I actually went and looked it up on the Vray documentation, and what I found was checking that linear workflow. As you can see, it automatically applies the inverse gamma correction on your images, but there is also a little warning here. It is only intended if you are working with your legacy scene files. It is not a proper linear workflow. If you're trying to do things right, I'd show you another way. The best thing to do would be to take your textures and let's graph one of the textures here. I have a texture here. I'll just graph that. Let's get rid of that. Okay. Here's a texture here, and I don't really need that. There we go. So here's a texture here, and if I were to look at its attributes, what I could do is, instead of adding a gamma node in the middle, I could just go into the texture attributes, and under attributes V-Ray, I could add a texture input gamma that's found under the file node attributes, texture input gamma, and that would give me these extra V-Ray attributes, and I could just check enable gamma input texture correction there, and that would take care of linearizing my image right there. So I don't need to worry about it anymore. So I could just not use that and do that to my texture, and that will take care of things. Whoops, I'm sorry, not 2.2. I would want to set that off to sRGB here, and that will take care of things. I don't have to check the linear where is that? Yeah, the linear workflow option here. Okay, not the, let me repeat that. This would be set to gamma 2.2. I just want to put a sRGB on that, so I don't have to go in and gamma correct it in the linear workflow here. So the next setting would be, if you look at the Needlehole settings, he's using for the primary bounces, he'll be using the brute force GI, the quasi Monte Carlo GI. I like using irradiance map for something like that. I'd use irradiance map and use the light cache. So as you can see, I've baked out both my irradiance map and my light cache here. So I'm just reading from the file. So if you wanna know how to set that up, I'd recommend you go and read about that in the documentation, which is pretty good. All the things that I know about V-Ray are basically through this documentation and some other resources online. Coming back, as you can see, my light cache settings are pretty low for now, but for an image this size, that's actually correct. But if you are rendering bigger, you might want to take that. If you are doing HD frames, you might want to take that up to 2500 to 3000 subdivs. Any HD frames, you might want to go up and set up those values. And one more important thing I'd like to discuss is the dynamic memory limit for the raycaster params. Go and read in the documentation again, and you'll find some more information on this, but this value by default is too low. I don't remember the default value, but I like bumping it up to the value here. I don't know why I'm using 2000, but what happens is, if this is too low, your light cache calculations take forever. They might take hours and hours together, and bumping up this value, it's going to take that and render it in the fraction of the time it was taking before. So have a look at that. And I also like using render elements. So you can see I'm rendering a whole bunch of in the render buffer. I'm rendering all of these passes, and if I look at the frame buffer, I can actually go and have a look at some of those passes that I'm rendering. I'm also isolating the lights. If you notice, I'm isolating my fill lights and my key light. And the way you do this is, you go and create find that light select, yeah, light select, double click on it or just add one, and when you do that you are going to get this in the outliner. And what you do is you go and you drag your lights into it, into that group, and those lights will be rendered as a separate render buffer, which you can see here, key light. And I'm also rendering my raw lighting together, so if I wanted to, and you can see I've also got some render IDs here, ID pass, and then finally I've got my reflection, refraction, etc, etc. And if I want to have a look at all of those passes, I can go into nuke here, and you can see I'm splitting those all up right there. You can find all of those passes right there. I've got the key light. Let's look at it. I'm gonna press 1, and you can see that key light, and I've even got V-Ray dirt pass, which kind of comes out a little noisy. By the way, if you want to make a ambient occlusion pass from V-Ray, you would be adding a V-Ray, excuse me, I've got one here called V-Ray dirt. Oh, I don't think I have rendered it here, but in the previous one I have, so I could create that as well, if I wanted to. Let's add that, and so you would create a dirt path and you would throw that in there. I hope that's the right method. I'm gonna look it up. I keep forgetting stuff, so can't help it. So apart from that, yeah, coming back to nuke, I've broken up all of those passes. So I start with the light passes first. I'm gonna go and say RGBA, look at all of these light passes, and there's a diffuse there, so I'm kind of going and multiplying those together, and I get that, and I get that, and I'm putting it all together now. There's the ambient occlusion. This is without and this is with. Yeah, sometimes instead of using the dirt pass, I might go and render in a separate ambient occlusion using Mental Ray, and you can see that there is a depth pass, and I normally render those with the Maya software. So sometimes I use almost all of the renderers to create those different passes. And here's the reflectivity, the reflection, and the specularity on top of that, added together, and I'm getting something like that. And I don't think I'm doing the Z depth here. I think I'm doing it later on. So, and doing some final corrections, adding a couple of grades. Sometimes I like to write that file out and maybe add I think I'm adding I believe the reflection and specularity later on, after writing the lighting info. I don't know why I'm doing that. Sometimes I like to do things separately. And I've taken that image, written it out as a TGA, and here it is in Photoshop. So I'm doing some color grading in Photoshop, and I've also added, as you can see, depth of field here in post. So and I'm doing this using the depth that I rendered from Maya, and probably using the filter here. Yep. So I put these together and I add a lens blur using that alpha. I can add that depth of field afterwards. So that's my workflow of linear. That's my way of doing linear workflow in Maya and Vray. Looking at the most important thing one last time when you're setting up Vray's linear workflow is that you go under the Vray common, use the Vray frame buffer, use a floating point format, image file format, and let's come back to Vray. By the way, the reason you're seeing all of those are because I'm in the master layer and I did not create a separate layer. And under the Vray parameters, under color mapping, what I'm doing is I'm applying a gamma of 2.2 in the linear multiply, and checking the effect background and effect don't affect colors. This is for adaptation only, meaning I'm not going to be applying the gamma 2.2. I'm not going to be baking the gamma, I'm just going to be viewing it right here in the frame buffer. And don't use this. This is not good. Only useful when you're doing when you're opening older files that were created in Maya and Vray, and as you saw, some default settings which I have tweaked, and that's pretty much it. That's how I would use Maya and Vray. Okay, thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.